want to welcome everybody back. You're here for the third session of the 4-session grant writing series. It feels like I've thrown a lot of information at you. That homework is meant to help you get a chance to actually use the content when it's fresh, so that you can actually experience what it's like to write a project charter, or what it's like to tell a story about your work. And I hope that those were helpful. So today, we're going to spend a little bit of time hearing about your experiences with session 2 and the homework. And then our new content is we're going to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what it means to a grant writer, and to a grant writer that's helping an organization learn how to incorporate those principles. Then we'll spend a good bit of time talking about budgeting. And I'll just tell you now, budgeting is just another way to tell a story, except instead of using words, we're going to use some numbers and some words. And I say that there's a budget homework, but really at this point in the game, we're kind of now pivoting from, we've got a project charter done, we've got our 1-pager, and now you're really ready to start looking at what the funders want from you, and to start looking at the questions they want to ask you and what kind of budget they're going to ask you. So your budget homework really is going to be about, what does the funder want from you for a budget? And let's work on the actual budget that they want to see. So that's just a aha on what we'll be doing there. So the last time at the end of the session, I said, here are the elements of storytelling for our grant projects: the need statement, the project description, and outcomes. See if you can do a brief version of those, fit them all on 1 page, and then see if you can add some visual elements that kind of make this beautiful piece of work that you could hand to somebody, and by reading it, they would know what you're up to and what your organization has planned, and they'll feel some kind of amount of being compelled to want to engage with what you're doing. So that was the assignment. And now I'd like to hear from some of you, either about what it was like to do the homework, or if you didn't have time for the homework, how that idea of storytelling, and especially the need statement, has changed your way of thinking about your project. So I'm going to ask for some volunteers to share about your experiences.
Okay, I'll share. It's Kathy in Coos Bay. Hi, everyone. I wasn't able to get it all on paper, but I have bullet points, and I went through all of it and got, my outline made. And for me, it was just really, really helpful to focus on the perspective from the grant organization, and align the project with with what they're trying to accomplish. So it really helped me look at it from their perspective. So explaining what our needs are that also benefit their goals in providing us with the money. So it was really helpful to me in that sense.
And that frame that you're going to be working for them if they fund your project is really helpful. So that's terrific, Kathy. Thanks for sharing that. Somebody else. Karen, I'm going to ask Karen from Sayusla Outreach. What is it like now to have that one pager? How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel good, especially when you send it back to me. Yeah, it's definitely, like I said, I've never done any of this before, so it was interesting to see how that went, and I love doing things like that. So,
does it feel like you created a piece of art?
Almost, yes. Yes.
So Karen's was the sample that we shared. She's redoing the carpeting and replacing it with flooring. And her one pager was the one with a giant glob of bacteria with the cross out symbol. But the way you wrote it, and even, the contact information with that opaque image behind it, it was really beautiful. Mm-hmm. And you really have the whole story right there.
Well, thank you.
So when you go to start writing a grant, it may seem less like the whole story, but you're going to borrow from your project charter and your one pager when you write it, and it'll be much easier because those are kind of finished pieces of work, and you've had a chance to get the wording right. So you're not going to copy and paste exactly, but it's going to be easier to get that grant written now that you've got those two pieces under your belt.
Oh, good. I'm excited to do one.
All right. So Karen now and several of you are really ready to go to the funder and download what the questions are for your application and what kind of supporting documents you'll need. If they happen to say that you can upload other information that you might want to add, I'd suggest you add that beautiful one pager.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Anybody else? Did anybody get stuck and is frustrated at where they are? When that happens to me, and it certainly does on some projects, I do a couple of things. One, I will set a timer and say, I will work no more than another 30 minutes on this. And then when my timer's done, I'm done, and I'm going to not come back to it for another day. But when I do that, somehow the 30 minutes that I'm committing is, at that point, there's less pressure because I'm going to do it no matter what. And so then suddenly things start to flow. Because I'm giving myself permission to not have to be successful. And then lo and behold, I am successful. So that's one way I work out of it. Okay. So if you didn't finish a one pager and you want to work on it and share it, we'd be happy to see it. But you can also decide that you really don't have time to complete that part and you want to move on and just focus on the application. That's a fine decision too. They're tools for you to use as you move forward. All right. So let's go on. So I added this section on diversity, equity, and inclusion because as a grant writer, I'm finding that a lot of foundations, and particularly state and federal entities, are really asking organizations to incorporate these principles into their grant projects. And that's because somebody has told those foundations or agencies that this is something that they care about. And so they want to fund other organizations that also not only care about these principles, but they include them in the work that they do. So as grant writers, we've got to understand, what does that mean to our grant projects? What does it mean to incorporate an element of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if we have to do that, what does my organization need to do to come along with me and this need to incorporate these principles? So what I'm going to ask us to do is go through each one, make sure that we're on board with what the meaning is, and then we're going to brainstorm some ideas for how we would add each element. So to say this visually, let's go back to this circle, which is what an organization hopes to accomplish, or our mission. We know that if we want to get funding, that we have to overlap in that mission with the funder. And now what we're saying is the funder in that green circle, they're including DEI work. So, and they're saying, and if you don't overlap with us in being committed and guided by the principles of DEI, then we're going to be less likely to fund your work. So in a way, they've now added this to their mission, and they're asking for evidence that we have too. Okay. Leah, do you have anything to say from your perspective on what I just said about this new need to add DEI elements?
Yeah, I think that the folks working in programs are familiar with some form or another of DEI, or anti-racism, anti-oppression is what we call it in our field, that have some of the same elements. So they're, I'm sure, all familiar with those pieces, and knowing that it needs to go into their grant applications, they'll already be a little step ahead because of the work they're already doing around this work.
Okay, great. So, so let's start with diversity. And diversity is this general idea that if we have a diversity of thought and a diversity of lived experience, then when we come together to plan work and do work, the work is going to be richer, because we don't have one person or a homogeneous group planning and doing that work. So given that thought, Leah, can you help me? I think we decided what's a good project that we could use as an example?
We talked about a garden / maybe cooking combination.
Okay, so we're planning a project, and if I was saying, what could we do to add a diversity element to our garden and nutrition class? What are some ideas that you could add that would be kind of an innovative or interesting way to add diversity to that?
Teaching how to cook multiple like genres of food. That's not the right word, but
ethnic?
Yes, there we go.
We love it. Okay. So not just American food, or what we think of as American food. I love it. What else could we do? And you can put some thoughts in the chat if you want here too.
Yes, Whitney wrote Indigenous help with planting and meal planning. And folks could partner with their local tribes. A lot of them have some great resources and classes around food preparation and growing herbs and that kind of thing.
Okay, so we're adding kind of a focus of this new program that is going to be ethnic And then another one would be to reach out to the tribes for some type of curricula that they might already be using and incorporate that. What's another way that we could add diversity of thought?
Maybe Whitney wants to explain what the Three Sisters concept is that she wrote in the chat.
Oh, sure. I'm not the best representative to explain this. This is an Indigenous concept that I learned through NAIA in a brief course I did with them through school. And in their community garden, they utilize what's called the Three Sisters concept. And this is very like long tradition in their culture, and specifically here to the Pacific Northwest. And it's to grow squash, corn, and I would think sunflowers, Whitney. Okay, don't quote me, but I believe it's sunflowers. And basically the idea is that the way that they grow corns, beans, and squash. See, I knew I wasn't getting it right. Corns, beans, and squash. And essentially they all work together to, the corns provide like a place for the beans to kind of wind up and help provide shade for the squash and the big squash leaves. And they have a beautiful storytelling involved in that, as well as like meals that are indigenous, like what they traditionally would utilize those 3 meals for. And it's most utilized during harvest period, so kind of like that fall harvest time. So that's my limited memory.
Okay, terrific. I love it. And it's beautiful, right? So not only is growing food beautiful, but the balance of why you would do it in that way is beautiful. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts, a different angle at what a diversity element might be?
Well, Annie did put in the chat box around cooking for folks that are living out of a hotel and affordable cooking, sort of adding that element of the DEI to include folks who are maybe living at a poverty level or something like that.
Okay, I love that. And that gets close to the other thing that I'm thinking about, and that is when you're planning these projects, who's at the table to help you plan? So should you have somebody who has this lived experience of being homeless and not having accessibility to, beautiful produce, help you plan what might be involved in that project? Okay, so what I had for ideas, and this wasn't specific to a garden project, but just adding diversity elements. So adding board members who are from a different generation than current members, helping to plan new programs with input from clients, and directing marketing about programming towards groups who haven't participated in the past. So for each of these, you actually would include these elements in your project design. So they'd go in your project charter under the deliverables, right? And that would signal to the funders that you not only know what diversity means, but you've incorporated it into your project. Okay. So the next one is inclusion. And inclusion is about making your program or your project available to more people in a way that's safe and culturally appropriate. So there's a little bit of overlap, or can be, with diversity here, but let's take the gardening and nutrition class and now think of what are ways that we could make that class more inclusive. We're running a domestic and sexual violence intervention organization. What could you do for your gardening and nutrition class to make it more inclusive?
You can make sure that there's translators. You can make sure that there is sign language interpreters. If it's cooking classes, they need to be ADA accessible so that there's different counter heights. So people who may not be able to stand the whole time are able to sit. There's a few.
Okay, I love it. And what about culturally appropriate?
Okay, I'll take this one. So look at the population that you serve and see what kinds of plants that you can incorporate that are used for meals. Mm-hmm. And these days, you know, in a garden, we can also have flowers and herbs and grow other things that attract pollinators. And some of those might be culturally specific to the population that you serve. So for example, here at the tribe, we might grow some grasses that could then be used for basket weaving and integrate that into the garden with the vegetables.
And that would make the participants not only feel safe, but very respected, right? So I think that's a great example of culturally appropriate. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other examples?
I don't know if this is an example. Hi, I'm Carly. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from the task force. One of the things I was thinking as y'all were sharing around diversity and now thinking about this inclusion piece is that my background is in public health. And so one of the things that we do often is like before we would even get to this grant writing period, backing it up even farther and saying like, how can we do some community needs assessment? So who are those folks that systemically we have cut out of the conversation entirely or who don't have access, and figuring out, so if we are working with youth, going to them and having those focus groups and saying, what are your needs? What's important before we're identifying for our project needs? So I think that framing can be really helpful and give us some more of these steps before we even get to the grant process. And so I was just thinking about that of like, these are really great, I think, in that application. And I think we can actually, I know we're all so busy, so getting that like jump on it beforehand and actually really meaningfully including folks, that inclusion piece for me, I think can happen before we're even at the part about like, okay, I have a cooking class. How do I get folks to be included in that in a meaningful way? So that's what I was thinking about.
That's perfect. And actually, I just came across a process that is really similar to what you're saying. The part of the American Recovery Plan funds, all those federal grant funds that are out there, went to Oregon Department of Environmental Quality to do septic replacements for rural communities. And the Department of Environmental Quality has run them before and the programs didn't go very well for whatever reason. So this time, they actually sent out something called an RFI, a request for information. And it was basically, if you were going to apply for a program like this, what would you need to make it worth your while and to make you feel like you could be successful? So they were actually asking us, how could they shape this program so that we would be likely to apply and that it would go well? And that feeling of being asked up ahead it just made me feel so good. And like, I can't wait to apply for those funds because they really cared about my opinion, right? So that inclusiveness really can make your program, it can make it feel like there's no way it can fail because you've got people on board. They've been included from the beginning. Okay, very good. So some examples of inclusion, and looks like I need to stop and start my slides again. Okay. Hold your services in a space that's wheelchair accessible. Hold a workshop with times on weekdays and at night to include those who work. Translate documents into Spanish. So those are just a couple of examples of things that would go directly towards inclusion. Okay. Here's a cartoon that everybody's seen of equality. Would somebody like to take a try at explaining what equality means using these cartoons?
I'll go for it.
Sure.
So the difference between equality and equity is equality makes everybody kind of at like the level. So as you can see in the picture, like everybody has the same size of little blocks to stand on, but it doesn't mean that they all have the same opportunity, because as you can tell, the taller person can perfectly easily reach the apple, but the smallest person doesn't have the ability. Equity, on the other hand, well, like it says, I suppose, helps remove those disparities. So it gives people what they need to make sure that they're actually having the same opportunities, and it doesn't just look like or appear that they are.
Yes, everybody is successful under the equity conditions, right? Whereas under these equality conditions, we only have one person who's actually getting to the outcome, right? Okay, good. So that's an excellent job on the definition. So now let's think, we're doing our gardening and nutrition program. How could we add, what would an equity element look like? Maybe we could talk about in our clients, what would the disparities be to begin with?
Experience in cooking or gardening.
Right. Yeah, I love that. Or a relationship with gardening or nutrition. They don't have that at all. So they're really in a different place. So knowing that, how would you design your program to include an equity element? First thing that comes to my mind is a survey to ask people if they have any experience gardening at all, or where they think they are in their understanding of nutrition, and where they are at in following the nutrition information that they know. Anybody think of another one?
So Perla put in the chat box, not just getting to the outcome, but obtaining further advantage. So I was wondering if maybe she could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that was back to the equality versus equity picture, and that, you know, with equality, some people are already at a further advantage than other folks, especially, you know, marginalized communities and underserved communities. And so whenever you make something, you know, equal, those folks that already had an advantage get an even further advantage, thus kind of causing this larger gap and disparity for the folks who don't have those same advantages, right? Aren't taller. So that person that's taller, if we're using the little cartoon, would have access to more apples versus the person who doesn't. So it just creates a further gap in our system.
And so you said it's not just reaching the outcome, but it's about further opportunity as well. They now have the tool.
Exactly.
Yes.
So they can, you know, eat for 4 days with apples versus just 1 day, right?
Yep.
And Carly said, providing childcare, transportation, paying folks to participate in the class.
Awesome. Those are great examples. Yep.
And Xander had his hand up.
Oh, yeah. So equity in terms of like garden and nutrition, my first thought is like space for gardening. Not everyone has a yard that is suitable for gardening or has a yard at all. So you could maybe focus on either connecting people to a community garden in their area. Maybe that's part of the class. Maybe you sign up for the class and you get a plot in the community garden, or doing like container gardening or something that you could do in like another situation that's not your typical garden setup.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Leah's right. Of all the classes I've taught, you guys are the most knowledgeable about DEI work and examples of them. So kudos to you. So some samples, some general samples that I had is equity for justice involved families might be helping them find rental housing after coming out of prison so that they are able to look forward, or have scholarships available for people who can't afford to pay for services. Someone said childcare, compensation for work lost. All of those are true. So great examples. Okay, now I wanted to just end by saying there are other specific questions that are often asked as part of grant applications. That I think are really helpful. So when you're planning a project, one of the things that I build into the element is, okay, we have this project that we're designing. Who can we get to help us to design the programs that are going to be more experience relevant or culturally relevant than we are, especially if we're trying to design programs that are inclusive. Another thing our organization is doing, and so that we do our work more meaningfully, is we track participation in our programs of the marginalized communities that we would like to see. So we've changed the way we ask participants about their demographics to include more categories that provide us with more information about how we're doing. We are asking for additional funds so that we can be more inclusive in our service delivery by adding elements like translation services so that we can reach populations that we hope to reach. So we're an organization who is, they say, on our DEI journey. We've been working at it for 4 years now, and we have quite a bit to celebrate and a whole lot more that we can still do to be on that journey. So my advice to groups that aren't as knowledgeable as many of you are in your DEI work is kind of this series of events. So first you need the basic understanding of DEI work at a staff level and at a board level. And so it's a terrific technical assistance project to bring a trainer in or to send people to trainings to better understand DEI work. And actually, Leah, did you see the one that's happening? I believe it's March 8th through Cliff Jones.
I don't think I saw that particular one.
There's one that's actually, I just ran across yesterday. I'm happy to share that. It's Cliff Jones, Alexis Millett, and somebody else. So that they're not hard to find. And then kind of the next step is having the organization articulate the importance of the DEI principles to the organization in an equity statement. And that's a little bit like a mission statement, except it's saying we include DEI principles in our mission. And then the last step is kind of everything else. It's proof that your organization is incorporating the DEI lens in the work that you're doing. And that can be things that we talked about above for that one class for any of the work that you do. So I'm on, in our organization, we call it a READY team, race, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And part of what we do is to help each of the programs stretch themselves to include diversity, equity, and inclusion in their program planning and in their program implementation. Okay, any other comments about DEI work or adding DEI elements to grant projects? All right, then I think we can go ahead and move on to budgeting. And this is my quote: budgets plan work to be done. Difference between budgets and financial statements are that financial statements capture what's already happened, and budgets look at what are you going to do in the future and how are you going to organize that work in terms of time, resources, and the projects that you're going to do. So it's future work. Now, when I say work to be done, we've already talked about that. Where did that come up before? It actually came from this, what we call a Venn diagram of our mission, what you hope to accomplish, and then the strategic plan, the what are you capable of doing and what's needed and feasible. So that intersection of them all, that's our work to be done. It's that sliver of our full mission that is the strategic work that we should be doing right now. So I just said budgets plan work to be done, right? And when I say it that way, it becomes like storytelling, right? So if our budgets are informed by strategic planning, the next obvious question is, what does your strategic planning process look like at your organization? Anybody like to share about what they've done maybe recently for strategic planning?
I can go on that one. Our agency recently did broke out into little groups to talk in depth about specific goals we had as an agency. So Xander and I were on the same group and we talked about how we can better serve youth in our community, where other groups talked about housing or how we can better serve the Latinx community and things like that.
Okay, awesome. And how long did that take?
Well, we got to take a day out of town to do that, but it took several. So our group took like a day or two to do it, but then each group, to get all the groups done, it took like 2 months or so, I think.
Okay. And so you just asked a series of questions about, what do you have capacity for right now? And what do you need? What's the external environment look like? And you got that done. And did Melanie lead it? So did you have somebody come in to lead it?
I guess I don't know what you mean, I guess.
Did you have somebody come in and facilitate that process?
No, we didn't have someone facilitating our own like brainstorm sessions, but we did have a consultant earlier on how to like identify the goals, I guess.
Okay, great. So that's a perfect way that happens. So anybody else, what's your experience with strategic planning?
This is Perla. I think I'll turn my camera on so you guys can see me. I think for our organization, we just, I work for El Programa Hispano. And so we just went through a fairly large strategic planning last year. And I would say that one of the challenges was getting not so much buy-in, but getting active engagement from all of the staff members in our organization. So we have staff members that are we're a pretty large organization that are like at various levels of leadership and job, and also like just background education. And so one of the things that we had to spend a lot of time on in order to get active engagement was to really break down what strategic planning means for a lot of the staff, especially like our direct service staff that really don't spend a lot of time thinking about just, looking towards the future, how to grow the company, what our mission, what our goal is, but they're kind of in the ground, kind of doing the day-to-day work. And so in order to get the feedback from them, which was really important because they're the ones actually with like feet on the ground, we had to go through this entire process of just educating them on what exactly the strategic planning process looks like, what it is, and why their input is so important in order for them to feel confident enough to begin to engage in the process.
Okay, that's a terrific answer. And it kind of is totally aligned with where I'm going. So strategic planning can seem like an overwhelming thing to do that requires a consultant, all these planning days, retreats, and it's so overwhelming that organizations kind of balk at doing it, or it becomes so formal that people don't feel confident in their ability to kind of help guide the organization. So in reality, fewer and fewer organizations are actually doing formal strategic planning. So what if we replace the word strategic planning with strategic thinking? And who are the champions of strategic thinking? It's us grant writers. And our budgeting process that happens every year is the one place where you really want to insert strategic thinking, because the budget is going to inform our future work, and we need to look ahead at what we're going to be able to be doing in the coming year, what projects we think we can get done, and which ones are aligned with our mission work. So I think if you have a budget process that includes space for lots of people to participate and to infuse that strategic thinking, then you kind of remove some of the need for that formal strategic planning. And it doesn't have to happen all that often, but you're still guided by strategic thought. So these are kind of the steps for a strategic plan. First, you do some kind of brainstorming or visioning to come up with what's the future work that you should be doing. And then there's a step to prioritize how many of these can we actually do and what would a timeline be for these activities. And then hopefully you're developing some kind of plan for who's going to be involved in all of these projects and how are we going to get them funded. Well, if you think about that, steps 3 and 4 really are defining how much is this work going to cost and where are we going to get the money from. And really, that's a lot like the grants we're writing, right? So when we do a strategic plan process, for the most part, we really accomplish these first two steps. What are all the things we could do? And then which are the ones that we really feel like are the best fits? And when do we have them outlined? If we can get that out of a strategic plan, then we as grant writers tend to take over. And now we have to figure out how much is going to be involved and where are we going to get the money to raise to do the projects. So we kind of meet the organization at that step. Now, what I've done for organizations I've worked in, especially smaller organizations, is as part of the budget process, we just have a maybe 2.5 hour session of what new future work should we be doing? If it's part of your budget cycle, then it doesn't have to be a whole retreat. It's just listening to what the staff have in mind, maybe a survey to include our direct service staff, and then confirmation that we're headed in the right and the responsive direction. So that's a way we can think about that so that we always have a strategic picture of where we're going. And I think I see something in the chat. Oh, that's Leah. Okay. I'm going to pull my slides back up. Okay, so now we've got our, here are the elements that we think we should be doing. The strategic planning cycle, it isn't one thing. There are all sorts of reasons that you can do strategic plans. One is to focus on programming. Another one might be around a capital project. Or you could do a strategic plan around succession planning, right? So the format that you use and how it gets done can be really varied. But the basic questions are establishing some goals of where's our organization headed, and then breaking the goals down to what are the outcomes, what's the end result that we want to achieve, and then what are the strategies that we're going to use to get to those outcomes, and how do we create some measures and targets to know that we've been successful. And then we move forward, we start doing that work, and we then create the results that show that we get back to the goals. So that's kind of the big picture of strategic planning. But how you do it, whether you bring a consultant in or you read about strategic planning and then take it on yourself, is really up to your organization. Now I'm going to ask Leah to chime in, because as your capacity person, she probably has some ideas on good resources for groups that want to initiate a strategic planning process.
Indeed, I do. In fact, the coalition can help with that for free. We can do an overall strategic plan with your organization, and which would include your board, or project strategic planning, whatever that looks like for you. We'd be happy to help. And if you want an outside consultant instead, we have some resources. Just reach out to me and I'll send those to you.
Great. Okay. So now we're starting to think about a budget, and I'm going to use the same once upon a time and the end that we had for our grant story with narrative. And what I'm saying is, if a budget's done well, then it actually speaks to the person reading it, and it tells the story of what you're going to do in enough detail to duplicate the effort. Now, how many of you are math people, and that numbers really have meaning for you and they're a beautiful thing? Okay, great. So we're going to use that. The numbers are going to be just as important as the narrative, but we're going to use a combination of both to have these budgets speak to us. The other thing that makes it more complicated is sometimes we think of a budget as a single thing, but as grant writers, the story of our budgets are always changing because we don't apply for grants one time in the year. It happens throughout the year. And the story of the work that we're going to do keeps changing. It grows because we submit 3 grants and we have new ideas for future work. Some of our grants get denied, and so it shrinks. And then we have a couple that come in, and so the story keeps changing. Since that's the case, we're going to need to make sure that our organization knows that the budget picture is going to have to shift in their minds too. Now, the budget's just a model, right? We don't know that it's true. Financial statements are true, but we're modeling what we think we're going to be doing and how we're going to generate enough resources to do that programming. So we get to decide the way that we present the model. And so what I'm going to do is show you some examples of budgets that you can use in different ways to show different kinds of information. Before I do that, I also want to ask and stretch you a little bit in this way. What's the difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit? Anybody got a good definition?
It's the ownership of the organization.
Okay, and what do you mean by that?
Well, a for-profit entity, there's usually a private owner or a public owner. Either it's stockholders or it's a single individual or something like that. Arguably, no one owns a nonprofit. It's beholden to its stakeholders, but it has no stockholders.
Okay. So what you could say is the board of directors doesn't financially benefit from the organization, right? They're not making money. Okay, but I didn't hear you say that the nonprofit doesn't make money, right?
Right.
Because we know that nonprofits can make a lot of money. Okay, I love that difference. Any other differences? Nonprofits don't pay taxes, right? We're tax exempt unless we do something that is not a charitable activity. So if we start selling pizzas and suddenly we're competing with Domino's, then we're actually going to have to pay taxes on those pizzas that we're selling. So in some cases, we do have to pay taxes. But we think of these as 2 very different things. And so the slide that I'm going to show you now, hopefully will stretch the way that you think of organizations so that it's not one or the other, and that there's really a spectrum of what it means to be a nonprofit and a for-profit. So we're going to split the 2 down the center. We've got our nonprofits on the left and our for-profit on the right. And we're splitting them down the center because everything on the left is motivated by their mission. We're here to accomplish our mission. What's the motivation for the for-profit? Make money, right? But we have these groupings of organizations in between where those motives get blurred. So for example, a social enterprise still is a nonprofit, but it's a nonprofit that is mission inspired, but it's set up to actually make money. Sometimes it's to make money to give to a specific organization. Can anybody think of an example of a social enterprise?
Is it like that sock company that gives a pair of socks for everyone that's bought to a homeless shelter?
It is, except Bombas you're thinking of? I would say that they are actually there to make a profit. They're a socially responsible business. Now, I could be convinced other, but a social responsible business is making a profit, and they're giving a portion of their profits back to do good. A social enterprise is not siphoning off their profits to their investors. And I'm not actually familiar enough with Bombas to know where they fit, but it's kind of fun because it points out the two different entities. The organization that I work for, NeighborWorks Umpqua, we have a social enterprise. It's called Heartwood Resources, and it employs justice-involved individuals to run a used building materials store. So they get donations from construction companies and from the community, and they sell them. And they generate $600,000 a year, which employs the justice-involved individuals in the community. So they're a nonprofit entity, but they have a nice mission that they're accomplishing. They're also generating significant amount of money to benefit a social group. Any thrift stores that organizations run, that can be a social enterprise within a nonprofit. Can anybody think of another socially responsible business?
I listen to a lot of podcasts, and so I feel like one that's always on there is recently is Figs. They're a company that does clothing for folks who work in the medical profession, and they'll donate a percentage of scrubs or things like that a year to folks who are working in the medical profession. So I think
great.
That's one that I've heard a lot recently.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you wanted to respond. I was going to say Ecosia. I think I'm saying that right. It's like a browser search engine. And then when you use the search engine, like some like very large percentage of its profits goes towards reforestation. So whenever you like search through it, you're basically planting trees.
Okay, and that could either be a socially responsible business, or depending on what the percentage is, maybe it's a corporation that practices social responsibility.
I remember it was well over 50% of its profits. It was in like 70 to 80 range.
That does sound like a socially responsible business. So then on the nonprofit side, we have the social enterprises. Heartwood Resources, it's his own nonprofit. The whole entity is a social enterprise. But then we have nonprofits that might have an income generating activity like a thrift store. So what this spectrum shows is there isn't a right or wrong. And the amount of money that you generate, how much focus you have on creating revenue versus doing your mission work, there isn't a right or wrong either. There are just different business models. And sometimes creating an income generating activity or even thinking of a social enterprise is a really smart strategic move so that you can do your work. There's a story of a nonprofit with income generating activities that I think is really fascinating in Roseburg. Source One Serenity is an organization that serves veterans. veterans with PTSD, and they take them on outdoor activities and fly fishing. But you know what their plan is to generate revenue so they can afford to do this? They have a vermiculture worm composting business out at the transfer station. So they're buying a truck to go around to the grocery stores and take their old produce. And then they have these giant worm bins where they compost food and sell worm castings. And the money that they receive from that is going to be what they're going to use to provide free services to their clients. Pretty cool? So that's an innovative way of looking at what might come out of kind of a strategic planning effort to find out how are we going to fund the stuff that we want to do when we know our clients aren't able to pay. Grants can go a far way, but then these social enterprises or income generating activities can also be terrific kind of future thinking projects. Okay, so that was a spectrum, but now we're going to start looking at some budgets. Did we go through I think we went through this budget cycle last time, is that right? Maybe not. Okay, so here's our budget cycle. Let's think about a project. Let's think about that gardening and nutrition class project that we were using for the DEI activities. So the first thing that we would do to create a budget is to just do a brainstorm and think of all the expenses that we're going to have. We're going to create some garden plots on site at a shelter. We need a fence, we need a tool shed, we need tools, we need soil, we need wood for raised beds. We need to pay somebody to come in and coordinate that project. And then we need a nutritionist to come in and do some classes. And we're going to need some money for food so that we can have participants make some food during the nutrition classes. So there's our kind of brainstorm. And then we're going to make some terrific guesses, or what I call guesstimates, about how much each of those things are going to cost. When I first start doing this, I have different colors of highlights that I make for, is this a blind guess that I really don't know at all? Or have I actually looked this up? Or have I done this before? Do I have a pretty accurate guess about what it's going to cost? So we've got all of our costs, and then we go down and we say, which of these costs do we think we might get donated? And what are we going to have? Who are we going to assign to see if we can get those things donated? The things that we can get donated, we're going to call in kind. And so then we're going to draft our expense budget, and we're going to say, here's all the cash that we're going to need, and here's the things that we think we can get donated, so we won't need cash for those. Once we have our expense budget, then we're going to create our funding plan. And we're going to do it in those same two columns, because anything that we have as in-kinded for expenses, that's going to be in-kinded for revenue too. But the cash expenses, we're going to have cash in our revenue for. So that means we now have our draft budget of both expenses and revenue. We then need to send it to somebody and say, here's my first shot. Provide some feedback for me. And after we have feedback, then we're going to go back around and we're going to come in and get some bids or do some better guessing or go online and find some actual prices. or look up the salaries and think about how many hours the staff are going to be using for their projects. We're going to refine our expenses. We're going to try maybe a little harder to see what we can get donated. So we'll have a more accurate expense budget. That means we can refine our revenue budget, and that the second time around, we'll have a better draft budget. It may take 3 cycles before you have a budget that you feel confident enough to use in a grant application. But that's actually how I do it. I create a lot of budgets. So let's take a look at some of these budgets. So the first thing is, if we think of budgets as resource stories, what's the difference of having a budget with just cash and a budget with cash and in kind? What does it look like? So here's a cartoon, and it's showing, this is for the whole organization, that let's think of this organization as a food bank maybe. They bring in 25,000, they're expected to spend 26 in the next year. So they actually are budgeting for a deficit. Not a balanced budget. Is that okay to do? Are you allowed to do that? Xander's shaking his head no.
Yeah, that's a no-no.
Well, maybe it's not good practice doing it over and over, but there are actually times when that's perfectly fine. Maybe you have carryover cash from the last year that you're not showing on your budget. You might have, or you might be planning to use reserves, and those don't show up on a budget. So they're actually, unless you have it in your bylaws that your budget has to match, there are reasons that it doesn't have to. But I'm pointing that out for a reason. Because when you add in kind, because it's not real money, you actually have to have it equal 0, because then the revenue and expenses exactly match. They cancel each other out. And so you're left with the numbers of just the cash in your overage or not. So let me show you what that looks like in real terms. So we're going to use the example of a fictional food bank, the Water Valley Food Bank. Can everybody see this clearly enough? Aaron's saying no, it's a little small. So here's an organization. I've actually organized it by direct expenses, overhead expenses, and fundraising expenses. Does anybody know why I might want to do it that way? I do it that way because when you go to create your 990s, your tax forms, those are the categories that they actually ask for. So I'm kind of pointing out that I'm a little savvy on how to organize my budget, but it doesn't really matter. That's just the way this is set up. So for this organization, we're just looking up at cash, and it looks like they bring in about 28,000, and that they spend about that amount, and that they have a little bit of surplus predicted for the next year. But is this really a good story of what this organization is doing? No, because this is an all-volunteer organization. And so if you had only this information about what this organization was doing, it'd be really hard for you to tell what's going on or what happens at this food bank, right? So now let's add the in-kind and see how it changes the resource picture. So here's cash, and look at this. Instead of bringing in 28,000 in resources. The organization is almost double that size when we add in kind. And we're also going to get a different picture of how the organization is operated. So what kind of in-kind is this organization getting? Well, looky here. It looks like they're getting a whole bunch of volunteer help, and they're estimating the value of this volunteer help at $15 an hour. Great. They're also getting some donated food, and it looks like somebody probably looked up on the irs.gov what the value of that food was, and they're getting some donated equipment. Okay, great. 20,100 in revenue. And now what we have to do is take that same 20,100 and say, what are those volunteers doing with that time? So what are they doing? Well, here we've added another column, program coordination and data tracking. There's some time spent there. Food bank staffing, time there. Facility maintenance, fundraising coordination. So here's a volunteer celebration, some expenses there. So all of a sudden, we now have some staffing that we can see because we're showing what the volunteers are actually doing to make that organization happen. So this is a much better resource picture with adding in kind. And now we have a much better sense of what they're doing and how much resources actually pass through this organization in the year. Pretty cool? Now, to get that to work, what did we have to do? We had to track what was the volunteer labor that we actually had and how many pounds of food we brought in. And then we used these numbers to estimate the value of those donations. And then in our expenses, we actually had to say, what were those volunteers doing? So we had to add several lines or rows to our budget to share what those volunteers were doing. But now we have a picture that funders will look at and give and know a lot more about the Water Valley Food Bank. So if you wanted to start setting up your budgets this way, you could do so with just a little bit of modeling of what are you taking in and then how is that being used.
I'm sensing a question.
Good.
That folks might be thinking, does the in-kind revenue total need to match the in-kind expenses total?
It always has to, because remember, again, it's not real money. And since it exactly balances, then it goes away. Money in, money out. So that the difference in the cash budget is the only thing that shows up. And that actually allows it to jive with our accounting systems too. But when you go to write a budget for a grant, it's really easy to forget that the in-kind revenue and the in-kind expenses have to match. And I will guarantee that Leah and I have missed that on grants before. So, and some of you will too as we work towards your budget. So we'll just help you remember that when we get there. Okay, so how do we know the value of in-kind contributions? Our friends at the Ford Family Foundation actually have a whole piece on how to calculate in-kind contributions and resources where to find that. The trickiest one is labor. And as Leah said, there are different ways that you can look at that. Every state has an average value for volunteer time. And if you're writing a state grant, you can include that. Travel Oregon has you use minimum wage, but most grants actually tell you in their guidelines what they want volunteer labor counted as, okay? Volunteer labor is different than what we call professional labor. So volunteer labor means that they're coming in and they're being a generalist. They're helping with work parties, or they're doing mailings for the organization. But if you hire somebody, or if somebody donates services that they do for a living, like a lawyer, and they give it to you for free, then you can actually use the rate that they charge for those services, the going or prevailing wage for that task, as the donated fee. So if you have a lawyer on your board and they do a bunch of legal work for you, that they may bill at $300 an hour, and you can actually count that donation as that amount. Okay? Or if you have a partner organization that's partnering with you on a project and you're not paying for their time, then you can count their staff wages as the going rate for those professional services. They might not be considered general volunteers. It takes some practice to learn how to add in kind, but it's a good thing to start working on, because many organizations count in kind time just like they would cash. Okay, so when we think of budgeting, we think of that future plan. And if you want to, if you're maybe new at grant writing, you can say, well, my future plan is that we're going to raise $2 million in the next 2 months, and that we're going to construct a building project we'll have it up and done in 6 months from now. So when we are overambitious in our budgets, it goes terribly wrong, because we've created an unrealistic budget, and there's no way that we're actually going to meet the goals of the budget. And what happens is you can really ruin your reputation as an organization that knows how to do its work if you're overambitious in your budgets. So what I say as guidance for sustainable budgeting is that you don't want to produce an unrealistic short-term plan. That budgeting is for the long haul. And so you have to think long-term in how do we collect the resources and sustain them over the long term, so that our projects will keep going. If we're too ambitious and we blow it, then we have to deal with the consequences of looking really bad after the period where we didn't do the work that we said we were going to do. So I call that short-term gain or short-term promotion. And it means that you might get people to believe you, but when you fail to reach those goals, then you're going to have to spend a long time after that proving to people that no, you are reliable. They can trust you, that you can do what you say you're going to do. So we don't want short-term promotion. We want to be as realistic and conservative as we can on our budgets, so that they're believable and so that we can actually do the work that we say we're going to do. And so to do that, 3 means that we're going to need to use different forms of budgeting for different applications. And 4, who's really responsible for the assets of our organization? That's our board of directors. So we better make sure that the board of directors sees and approves our budgets. And not just that once a year budget, but as our budgets change, that the board understands what's happening and why it's changing. So we think of budgets as once a year. Well, I think a quarterly budget for grant writers is not out of the possibility. So you may have a board approved budget that they approve once a year, but I'm going to go back as the grant writer, and every quarter I'm going to update what I think really is going to happen so that I can tell my executive director where we're at, and if we're in danger of getting behind on our budget, that person knows about it. And maybe we need to start looking for some additional grants if we're falling short of what we thought and the timeline looks like it's going to slip for our projects. Okay. Now, we talked about fundability of expenses the last time. I'm going to go over that again because it's such an important part of planning budgets. So what we said was the thing that funders love the most fundable of expenses are the programs that we're doing. And that's because those are helping us accomplish our mission. As programs age, they become less desirable to funders unless we can convince them that those programs are still relevant and still needed. But funders, especially grant funders, they think of themselves as the catalyst for something new, and that the responsibility for existing programs is for the organization to figure out how to sustain them. So even though that's kind of painful, that's kind of the lay of the land that we live in. Now that's true. What's also true is that admin and fundraising expenses are even less desirable for grantors. They don't want to fund those. So we have to accept that, and we have to creatively think, well, how do we still get all of these things funded? Because our organization isn't going to survive without the administrative pieces and fundraising pieces. So that's why we have to generate different types of revenue to pay for all the things that we have. So we have different levels, what I call flexibility of use, or what can we spend those things on? If we go after a grant for our gardening and nutrition classes, then that's the only thing that we can spend that on. If we go after an operating grant, we can spend that on whatever we want. So the unrestricted grants are very flexible. The restricted grants don't have any flexibility. And these other forms of revenue are in between. So say we have a fundraising event. Well, that could be an event that we generate funds from that we can spend on whatever we want. But if we have a fundraising event that is raising money just for our gardening and nutrition classes, and we advertise it that way, then we've actually put a restriction on the revenue from those events. So it can be complicated. So when we put these together, what we see is a plan for how we're going to fund everything. And as you can see, the X's mean how much emphasis we're putting on it. The new programs, we're relying on our grant funds to get those going. We also have some other revenue streams that we're putting into those new programs as match for our grant. Now then, as that program ages, it's less likely that it's going to be funded by grants. So what we have to do is change the way that we think of how we fund that existing program. And now we're going to have to build some other revenue, like a fee for service, or do some more fundraising to keep it going. Now, what's a little different about DV groups is you guys have some some steady state funding for your programs. And that means that those programs, even though they're existing programs, they're still going to get those restricted grants. And you don't have to be quite so savvy on how do you develop other revenue streams to pay for those expenses. But my guess is you do have to look at those other revenue streams to fund your admin and your fundraising costs. And so we do things like down here, we don't have to go after any operating grants to have our new programs funded, but we're going to look for operating grants that will help us with our administrative costs and our fundraising costs. Does that make sense? So the biggest problem with existing programs is that staff members don't switch from thinking of it as a new program to an older program, and they don't switch the model of how are we going to pay for it. And when the grants go down, it means that they start scrimping and saving on their program. It's no longer as robust. It doesn't hit the outcomes that they hope for. And then they have a troubled existing program that they have to figure out what to do with. Now, that's one of the reasons that I shared the article with you of how is an old program like a fruitcake. And so I think in that context, you'll enjoy reading that article. Okay. So I'm going to skip over these. These slides that I have here are just following that same sustainability element, and they're following a new program as it ages and how I'm changing the structure of how it's funded. That's great for program development, but again, since a lot of your programs are already stably funded by state programs, we're going to skip that so we can go on to some other pieces. So now I'm going to do a more complicated look at your organization. Same thing though. Here's an organization. It's got a new program that it's thinking about starting. It's got 2 existing programs, and then it's got administrative, and I didn't put fundraising costs on here. We just included them with admin. So here are all the things that this organization does. And it's an organization that spends and takes in $300,000 a year. Now, remember when I said that we get to decide how we model our budgets, what the resource picture looks like? Well, we can add in kind to change that, but we can also adjust the way that we think of our administrative costs. So how much does our new program going to cost us? Well, in this view, our new program is going to cost $45,000. But in addition to running the direct service part, the mission part, we're also going to have some administrative costs associated with running that program, right? So if we present the budget in this way, then everybody's going to look at our new program and say, yeah, it's going to cost $45,000 this year to launch that new program. But let's change the way we model that. Let's take our administrative costs and let's actually assign a portion of those administrative costs to each of our programs. Because are the programs going to happen without those administrative activities? Like accounting and an executive director? No, they're not. So we call it, we're going to split our admin across our projects. And I decided that I'm going to split it evenly across our projects. So instead of thinking of our new program as a $45,000 a year program, we're going to change that and we're going to ask our board of directors and staff to actually think of it as an $81,000 project. We're not changing the amount that we need for our organization, but we're allocating our admin to our programs. I'm allocating admin to our programs A and B, but look at that. I've decided that I'm going to allocate admin evenly. Is that fair? Well, you could think of it this way. To launch this new program, you might need a lot of the executive director's time or the development director's time to get new grants going and to figure out all the staffing plans and what's going to actually happen. So you could say, it makes sense that the new programs might have a bigger percentage of the admin costs. And maybe program A here basically runs on itself, so we don't need as much admin cost for that. So part of budgeting when it comes to sustaining programs is figuring out how can we get some of our administrative costs paid for by these new programs and existing programs that the funders want to give grants to. Okay, isn't that kind of a neat trick? So now when we fund our new program and program A and B, we've actually done all the work to fund our admin. So we don't need those other revenue streams, or not as much of them, in order to fund our admin, because we've changed the way that we're modeling how much our programs cost.
So I have a question that people might be thinking.
Yeah.
So when we're using the terms program and project, we think of the whole agency as a program, and then the project within it are those sort of, usually those ones that are short term, that's a project. If it's a longer term, like support groups, then we sort of call it programming.
Yeah.
So can you just sort of say how those terms sort of fit in when you're talking about new program versus established program?
Okay, great. So, and I'm actually kind of using program and project interchangeably. So let's say that program A might be our advocacy services. Program B might be our shelters. And maybe you have 2 or 3 shelters, but you're calling them shelter services. So they're all together. And maybe our new program is a job training program that we don't have that we want to bring. So part of creating a budget like this is kind of understanding what your cost centers are and actually kind of being able to code those costs into those cost centers. Because each one of those cost centers is now going to have its own budget. A capital project would be its own new column. So I would call that a project. Does that answer it? Now,
yes.
When does a project that's short term kind of elevate to being included on a budget like this? You could put a bunch of them together and say small projects, right? But as the grant writer, if I know that I'm assigning admin to each of these programs, that means when I go to look for funding, I have to see that I'm looking for 81,000 of funding. And I'm going to research grants, and some of the funders, when I read through the details, they're going to say, yeah, we're going to allow you 10% admin costs. And 36,000 of 81 is a lot more than 10%. So then what am I going to do? So this is what I hope for, right? This is my future plan, but it doesn't always work that way. So if I am going to a funder who's only going to give me 10% or 8,000, then I know that I'm still going to have 28,000 of administrative costs that aren't going to be met. And so I'm going to go back to that other model of we still have to figure out some other revenue to subsidize our admin for, because this is sort of overly ambitious. But if the funder will let me get 20% of my project in admin, and plenty of them do, then it's only smart to ask for as much admin as we can get from that funder. And it starts to feel like a negotiation. And you'll be surprised at how many funders really understand the need to have organizations have enough admin to keep themselves healthy and sustainable. So they're very willing to give you the percentages that you need for it to make sense for you to operate the program. So that's kind of a level of sophistication of budgeting that I wanted you all to hear, but you may not be at that level right now in where you are or how you're running your organization. There's a great book, and I'll share it with you. I'll have Leah post it. It's called Financial Leadership for Executive Directors. And oh, there it is. Hold it closer to you, Leah, because we can't see it. It's green screened out. Anyway, Leah has it, I have it. The Ford Family Foundation has it on their free Select Books program. And it actually shows you how to set up an organizational budget to allocate your admin costs. And it's very cool. The first time that you do that for an organization, you just feel like you've learned so much about budgeting and you've made it to the top. Okay. So here's an example where I have actually changed the way I'm allocating my admin, still the same amount of admin, but I'm saying, hey, funders want to fund these new programs more than they do with the old funders. So I could justify actually putting a different amount of admin for my new program, different than my existing program. So again, we're modeling how much resources is it going to take for us to actually do these programs. And it's okay to state, this is how I'm allocating admin and here's why. This program is going to be a heavy lift for us administratively to get off the ground. So we're assigning it extra admin. Okay.
So Meredith, could you go back one slide just for a second? You might have covered this, but one of the sort of ways that I would get admin into a grant when it only allowed a certain amount of admin and I knew that the project was going to take more than that is I would put my admin time in the in-kind and charge it to a different grant.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. The other thing that, that you can do is Leah was an executive director, but maybe for the new project, she was not only going to be the administrator for the project, but she might be stepping in and doing some of the delivery. And so we can actually chop Leah up into FTEs, full-time equivalents, and we could assign 25% of her time here in red for the administrative costs, but we can put her as a program expense the 75% of the time. And so that's another way to keep the administrative costs low. if some of your staff is doing both, it's okay to assign them to both program functions and to admin functions. Okay, and then there was one other example. So there are times when funders will say, yeah, we don't allow admin at all. So then what do? Well, that's when you have to think about, is this the right grant for this new program? Because if they're not going to allow me admin, and it's going to take a lot of admin resources to make this program happen, maybe I need to look for a different funder, because I don't want to have to figure out how to fund all those extra admin costs. And I don't think my old programs can assume this higher level of admin. So then I'm stuck. So part of what I'm doing when I'm looking for grants is, are they going to give me enough admin or a reasonable amount of admin so that I'm not stuck having to write a bunch of operating grants to keep my programs going? Yep. Awesome. Okay. Now, here's the another level, and then we're going to look at some specific grant budgets. So for those of you that are thinking about hiring staff using grants or doing a capital campaign, they're going to take a specialized multi-year budget, because the project that you're doing is going to span more than 1 year. And so for a lot of the staffing grants, like if you ask Meyer Memorial Trust for a development director, you can ask for just 1 year, but you can also ask for 3 years of funding. 3 years of funding, and you may say, for the first year, I'd like 75% of the costs of that person. For the second year, I want 50% of the costs. And for the third year, I want 25% of the costs. And we'll make up the difference as we go along. So in order to do that, we're going to have to create a budget that goes out for 3 years. But you're going, wait a minute. The board only creates a budget for 1 year. So how do we do that? Well, it means that you're going to have to change your budgeting process to start asking the board to approve years 2 and 3, or you're just going to have estimates that you use, which is more likely for these grants. But it means that you're going to have to come up with a plan for how your revenue and expenses are going to change over time. And if you're asking for a development director, what's that person doing? They're raising money. So you're going to have to tell a story of how after you hire that person, they're going to start generating significantly more resources for the organization, which is actually over time going to pay for their salary. So it's really the basis of your ability to tell a story through that multi-year budget that's going to get the grant for you. So I actually have an example of that, but it's too small for people to see. But you can see I have 3 years of funding. This particular budget is for a development director, a part-time development director, and you have it in your PowerPoint deck. So if you're interested in working on a budget like that, I just wanted you to see what it looks like. Now, what's interesting is not only do I have to show that this person that gets hired in year 1 comes in and starts raising a lot more money for the organization, but I have to show in expenses, what are the new programs that are being created and what expenses are going into that new program. So it becomes kind of like a big jigsaw puzzle that's very fun to create, but you're kind of making something out of nothing. You're telling this story. You actually have to believe in the story for it to be compelling. And it really does read like a story. If it was bigger, we could actually walk through that story, but we won't. Okay, what I do want to do is bring up the budgets that I have left for you so we can walk through what they look like. So here is a project budget. This is a sample that I've given you, and it's the most basic one. I did it in a Word document, so you don't have to know how to use Excel. And so let's look at what we have. This is a project called Facilities Generator Project, Keep Food Frozen. It's for our food bank. And I've set it up. This is just a simple project. We have expenses first, and we've got what is it going to cost in cash? What do we think we can get in kind? And then we're going to add those together and see what our total is. So let's see what our expenses are. The cost of the generator and insulation. We're going to put a concrete pad in. Oh, and look here for underneath the generator, and we're going to get help from the local 4-H club. So the concrete probably cost, and this is probably the cost of the 4-H club who's going to help us put that in. We're going to have electrical wiring. And look at that, no cash costs. So we found somebody to donate that. That's Jenny Taylor. And then we have project planning and administration. Now I didn't put the cost basis, but we have, here's cash, and we're donating some of that time in kind. And then we have a fundraising event in kind, where we're raising some of the money, and people are donating auction items. Okay, great. So we're bringing in $25.50. The first thing I do is I'm going to go to revenue and make sure that my in-kind matches, and it does. Not only does the in-kind match, but basically I'm taking the same categories and I'm putting them down here in revenue. So here's the electrician, here's the 4-H club, and here's the fundraising event. And then, so the grant, we're asking for $5,000. The fundraiser is gonna make $1,000. We haven't done it yet, so we said not yet solicited. We put secured down for our in-kind because we've already got agreements for that. And it looks like we're going to another foundation to pay for our staff costs. So voila, that's our simple project budget using cash and in-kind. Kind of cool? So what I'm going to ask you to do, you can use this template, or you can use the Excel one. If you know how to use Excel, then I would suggest the Excel budget, and it's the same type of thing. We've got, in this case, I put revenue on top. It doesn't matter if it's on top or in bottom. We've got, let's check our in-kind, 800 here, 800 there, that's good. So in this case, there isn't a lot of in-kind. It's just bookkeeping and accounting. We're using a professional rate of $25 an hour, and we have the number of hours here. And this one is another Oregon Community Foundation grant. We've got some cash reserves for revenue, and we've got some community donations, including in-kind. Okay?
So Meredith, this format of this one is very similar to some of the formats for the DHS grant reporting financial reports that programs have to do. So if anybody in the class is already doing those, then they're going to be familiar with this layout.
Yes. Now, every funder will have a different kind of budget. So what I do is I have the budget form that I like to use, which is a whole lot like that Excel budget I just showed you. So I start by creating all budgets using my template. And then when I go to the funder, I'll see what they want. Sometimes they will say, if you already have a budget in a format you like, you can use that one, but that's rare. Usually they want you to put it in their template. But the people that I work with are used to my template. So I actually make my own internal budget, and then I also submit one for the funders. But that's it for budgets. So we don't know what you're going to get. It depends on the type of project you're working on and the funder that you're going to go to. So you can, when you go to the funder to pull out the questions they're going to ask, also look to see what kind of budget template they're going to use. And we can start working on getting the budgets going for the project that you're going to work on. I know you'll have questions. We want you to come to us with questions, especially for the budgets, and we can work together on those. So we're ready to have you jump in and start working on actual applications now. Any questions about, there's not really a budget homework. It's go ahead and move forward with your project and the funder grant. And if you want to try drafting a budget for your project, go for it, using either my template or the one for the funder that you're going to compete for. So that's it for today. What questions, comments, or kind of debrief would you like to share?
How common is it for nonprofits to end up with a social enterprise funding a lot of them?
I think the longer the organization is around, the more likely it is that they're going to figure out some kind of way to get volunteers to contribute to the revenue stream. Once they've created belief from the public in who they are, they can really be powerful. I mean, hopefully it's something that is mission aligned, that the folks that are doing it can really believe in.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think I might have budgeted everybody out. That was a lot of information. All right, thanks everybody, and we will see you on the March 3rd for the last session.